think that's it. Yeah. Okay, so you should now be able to share it.
Okay. It's not showing.
Yeah, it hasn't popped up for me yet either.
Hmm.
Oh, but it's on. That's weird.
It's showing up on my side.
Yeah, it's showing up on my side also, but I don't see. Oh, no, never mind. Okay, so are you ready, sister?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, let's get started. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. My name is Hamza Reed. I'm sorry. I am the Director of Operations at the Multicultural Center, and I'd like to welcome all of you guys to our Family First Center's weekly Wednesday webinar, Alhamdulillah, now presented in cooperation with ISGH and Anissa Hope Center. This happens every Wednesday at 11 a.m. The format usually consists of a short presentation, followed by a question and answer session at the end, where we will field questions from the audience down in the chat box below. Today's topic is why don't they just leave? The mental health implications of domestic abuse, and will be presented by Sister Amina Ishaq. A little bit about Sister Amina. She has been a passionate advocate for women and children's issues. She's worked for the Georgia Department of Family and Children Services as a foster care case manager, and is now a licensed social worker with Anissa Hope Center at the Sakina Center. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Sister Amina.
Assalamu alaikum, Hamza. Thank you so much for having me again this month. And thank you to MCC and Anissa Hope Center and ISGH for collaborating and doing these mental health, weekly mental health talks. So today, like Hamza was saying, we are going to be talking about the mental health implications of domestic violence and what we as a community are doing to exacerbate the issue, and also what we can do to help. There's a common phrase that everybody uses when they think of domestic abuse, like, why doesn't she just leave? Or why don't they just leave? That's the first question that comes to our mind. And that's the first question that sometimes we throw out there to victims. And at Anissa Hope Center, we focus on advocating for domestic abuse victims and survivors. And we've actually been discussing this a lot in our organization for the past few months, because that is one of the key things one of the key questions that survivors and victims, they come and tell us, and they're like, this is what people say to us. And my mentor and director, Dr. Kadam Hamdan, she's an amazing psychologist, PhD from Harvard University, and she wrote an article on our blog about this question that the community and people in the community ask abuse victims. Why doesn't she just leave? Or why doesn't he just leave? So we're going to talk a little about that, but I'll go into what we can do as a community and what we can do as individuals to help people that are victims and survivors. But first, I want to talk about why so many abuse victims and survivors take so long to leave, or why they don't leave. Because a lot of times as a community, we need to be educated. We don't know. And that's why I love what MCC and Anissa and ISGH are doing here. We're educating our community on societal topics that are taboo, that people don't want to talk about, people are uncomfortable talking about. But we want to educate you on why women and men don't leave these abusive homes, and why we should show compassion and empathy. So of course, we promote that when it's a viable option, it's best for victims to do what they can to escape their abusers. However, this is not always the case in all situations. Abusers repeatedly go to extremes to prevent the victim from leaving. In fact, leaving an abuser is the most dangerous time for a victim of domestic violence. One study found in interviews with men who have killed their wives that either threats of separation by their partner or actual separations were most often the key and precipitating event that leads to the murder. So when a woman leaves or a man leaves, that is usually the precipitating event that happens that makes them commit homicide. So a victim's reasons for staying with their abusers are extremely complex, and they're case by case. And in most cases, they're based on the reality that their abuser will follow through with the threats that they have used to keep them trapped. That the abuser will kill or hurt them, they will hurt or kill their kids, they will win custody of their children, they will harm or kill their pets or their loved ones, they're going to ruin the victim financially, and the list goes on and on and on. So a victim in violent relationship knows their abuser more than anyone, more than me, more than you, more than the community. They know the full extent to which they will go to make sure that their abuser is victimized and they have control over them. So the power and control is the key component in this. And we talk about this a lot, but the victim is the expert on the abuser. We are not. So we have to understand that we are not the expert on the abuser. Every abuser is different. So we have to give that to the victim or the survivor. So the victim literally may not be able to safely escape or to protect those they love. A recent study of intimate partner homicides found that 20% of homicide victims were not the domestic violence victims themselves, but family members, friends, neighbors, persons who intervened, law enforcement responders, and bystanders. So 20% of the homicides that happen because of abuse are not the victims themselves, the abuse victims, but people that are trying to help. But that does not mean that we do not want to help these victims or survivors, but this is the reason why a lot of women and men don't leave, because they're scared that somebody else might get hurt. And that mental trauma on them, it's a lot to bear. It is a lot to bear. So that question, why doesn't she just leave, or why doesn't he just leave? It lacks empathy and it lacks compassion. So some of the other barriers that are barriers to escaping a violent relationship include many factors, and I'm going to go over some of them. So the fear that the abuser's actions will become more violent and may become lethal if the victim attempts to leave, unsupportive family and friends, and that's a big reason why many of the clients that come to us are not leaving, because they don't have a support system. They feel that single parenting is going to be difficult, like they're not going to have the financial capability. Victims feel that the relationship is a mix of good times and love and hope, along with manipulation, intimidation, and fear. So basically they think that we've had good times. They try to justify, well, that he's good at this time, she's good at this time with me. So, there's a lot of good times and bad times, and that's what marriage is. But then there's a lot of manipulation, intimidation, and fear. So when you see a woman being abused or a man being abused, it's not necessarily, they're not just seeing their whole life in that abuse. They're seeing the good times as well. So there's a lot of mental stress there, right? So the victim's lack of knowledge of access to safety and support. They may not know that they have the support. They may not know that there's DAIA and UNISA and ISGH and MCC out there to help them. So that's where we come in, right? As mental health professionals, we have to educate our community to let them know that there is support there, and we do love you, and we are here to help you. So fear of losing custody of any children if they leave or divorce, because that's a key thing that a lot of the abusers say, oh, I'll get the kids, I'll make you look crazy, I'll make you look insane, I'm gonna do this. And a lot of times we're working with immigrant communities and immigrant women that are from overseas, and they don't know their rights and their the knowledge that even women that are living and born and raised here, so that is a fear tactic that they use, and they're scared of losing custody. So lack of means to support themselves or their friends, their children and their families, not having access to bank accounts, not having somewhere to go, no friends and family, no money for a hotel, no money for a shelter, they don't know where to go, fear of being homeless, religious and cultural beliefs or practices that make them feel guilty or shame them if they get divorced, that may trap them in that relationship. And, there's a stigma, there's a belief, it's a wide belief here in the East and the West, that two-parent households are better for children despite the abuse. And yes, two-parent households are the goal. They are optimal, but when there's abuse in the situation, it's not optimal for that child. But that's what the belief is out there, that a two-parent home is better for my children, even if I'm being abused, even if that child is watching the abuse or being abused themselves. But we know through studies after studies after studies that children being in abusive environments is actually detrimental to their physical health or physiological health or mental health. And so some other reasons, societal barriers to escaping a violent relationship. So there's society that's telling them that they shouldn't be leaving. It's not even somebody actually saying it, but it's just reinforcement of our clergy, like secular counselors, clergy, imams, pastors, preachers, rabbis saying we have to save this relationship at all costs, rather than the goal of actually stopping the violence. Their goal a lot of times is not to stop the violence, but just be patient, be patient. And then that guilt, a woman or a man, it eats at that woman or man that, I have to be patient. I'll be rewarded in the hereafter. And yes, patience, there is a reward for patience, but not at the cost of oppression, not at the cost of being abused physically or psychologically for your mental health, because you have to take care of yourself. Your body and your mental health is an amana from Allah and from God, and you have to take care of yourself too. And that is not being patient. That is you have to stand up for your rights. And it's hard because that is a societal barrier that's, stopping so many people. And it's that shame and guilt. And we feel that we can tell a woman or a man, why don't you just leave? But then we have society that's telling them, oh, she couldn't work on her marriage or he couldn't work on his marriage. So the lack of support to victims by clergy, by police officers, by law enforcement who treat violence as a domestic dispute rather than violence, or instead of a crime where one person is physically attacking another person. Often victims of abuse are arrested and charged by law enforcement, even if they are only defending themselves against the batterer. So that's a reason. A lot of times a woman or a man will call and the police officer will be like, well, I have to arrest you because you defended yourself and you hit him back or you hit her back, right? So dissuasion by police of the victim for filing charges. A lot of time law enforcement, I think the law enforcement is getting better, but they have to be trained better as well. But there's so many barriers that are set in place for men and women that are trying to leave a violent relationship. And I want to emphasize why I say men and women is because yes, 90% of the cases of domestic violence are perpetrated on women, but we have seen perpetration of violence on men as well. So that's why I want to be gender neutral here. But I don't want anybody to think that it's happening to men more than women. 90% of the cases that we see and statistically are the women are being battered physically, right? But a lot of times with the men, it's more mental, psychological abuse, and we do see that. So I want to make sure that we're talking in gender neutral terms, like men and women, right? So a lot of times the law enforcement and society doesn't take the abuse victim seriously, right? Especially, let's say, with men. Oh, you couldn't put up with it, shaming them. You're not masculine. You can't keep your wife intact. Or like when she's psychologically abusing her husband or her spouse or her intimate partner, men get shamed, so they don't talk about it, right? And then like with women, they shame them as well. Why aren't you patient? Why aren't you putting up with this? Why aren't you just taking it? So just reluctance by prosecutors to prosecute cases as well. That's a barrier. Some may convince the abuser to plead to lesser charges, further endangering these victims. Additionally, judges rarely impose the maximum sentence upon convicted abusers. Probation or a fine is much more common. And then a woman gets scared. She's like, well, he's going to still have access to me or my children. And that's why I don't want to go through with this. There's so many societal barriers that stop women and men from doing this. So despite the issuing of a restraining order, there's little to prevent a released abuser from returning and repeating abuse. And like I said, that's when most of the homicides happen. So despite greater public awareness and the increased availability of housing for victims fleeing violent partners, there are not enough shelters to keep victims safe. And some religious and cultural practices that stress that divorce is forbidden, right? Even though we know in Islam, divorce is not forbidden, but there are some cultural barriers, cultural practices that say you have to put up with it. You die in this home. It doesn't matter. I know in South Asian culture, it is a very prominent thing that you die in the home of your spouse or your husband. It does not matter. You take it, whether you like it or not. So the socialization of some made to believe that they are responsible for making the relationship work. So that type of behavior of saying you have to make it work. A failure to maintain the relationship equals failure as a person. So if you cannot make this marriage work, you're going to be failure as a person. So this is all the mental trauma that society is placing on abuse victims. Just imagine the pain that a woman or a man is going through in society, the community telling you all this. They're like, what's the point of leaving? It's so difficult. We as a community, as society, have made it so difficult for men and women to leave abusive situations. And I feel like we have to put it upon ourselves too. We're not making it easier for anyone. We really aren't. Isolation from friends and family happens. I mean, they feel ashamed, they feel guilt. And this mental trauma of isolation, they feel like there's nowhere to go, nowhere to turn. So then the victim tries to rationalize that after they see that nobody's helping them and society's telling them to stay, put up with it, they start rationalizing that the abuser's behavior is usually caused by stress or alcohol or problems at work, unemployment, or other factors. That's what society starts telling them, right? That maybe he's doing this, or maybe she's doing this because she's stressed out about the kids, or he's stressed out about work, or he's an alcoholic. Maybe you can change him. We cannot change people. Only God can change people, and you do not have to be the guinea pig for it. So, but that is mentally, this is what abuse victims and survivors are telling themselves, that they're rationalizing in their brain that this is caused by something that they can't control. But you have to remember, power and control are the key factors in domestic violence and domestic abuse. So other societal factors that teach women to believe that their identities and feelings of self-worth are contingent upon getting and keeping a man. So this is not just perpetrated in Eastern immigrant communities. This is perpetrated here in the West as well. Women are always taught that if you have a man, your self-worth is like, why aren't you getting married? Why are you still single? It's all linked to being married or having a man in your life. If you don't have a man, or if you don't have a woman, or you're not married, your self-worth is, you haven't completed yourself. But that is a societal mental trauma that is on women and men. And that's one of the reasons why they don't want to leave. And a lot of times it's inconsistency in the abuse too, right? So during violent, non-violent phases, the abuser may fulfill the victim's dream of romantic love, right? He or she is the perfect romantic love partner. The victim may also rationalize the abuser is basically good until something bad happens and they have to let off the steam. So like I was saying, it's a lot of rationalization in their brain that they're going through, that most of the time he takes care of me, most of the time she loves me, most of the time he's giving me flowers all the time. So that non-violent phase keeps them there. They rationalize with themselves that, she or he, they're going through this, they're letting off steam, and that's the reason why this is happening. So it's a lot of rationalization. So just imagine the trauma, the mental trauma that a man or woman are going through because of societal expectations, societal pressures, community pressures. This is a lot to take, right? So when we say, why doesn't she just leave? Or why doesn't he just leave? Why don't they just get a divorce? But then we have another part of society saying, put up with it, be patient, do this. Like society has molded us to believe that we have to put up with this, right? And then not only that, they're rationalizing, they're having this mental trauma. If you don't have a man, you're nothing. If you don't have a woman, you're nothing. All of this is taking a mental toll on these abusers. So when we say, why don't you just leave? It lacks empathy. It lacks compassion. We are not in that situation to understand what they are going through. Every victim knows their abuser more than we do. So instead of asking, why don't you just leave? Dr. Hamdan wrote it so eloquently, and we talk about this, and I want to share what she wrote about what we can do as a community, as mental health professionals, what we can do to show empathy and compassion and elevate women and men that are in these situations, what we can do to help them. Instead of asking, why don't you just leave? Here are 3 things to ask instead. What do you need to feel safer and not feel worthless? What are your financial concerns? And what are you most worried about? These questions show compassion and empathy. These are the questions we should be asking victims of abuse, not why don't you just leave, right? If you really want to help someone in a domestic abuse situation, then seek understanding, not judgment. It's a lot easier to give advice and tell someone what to do, but professionally, Dr. Hamdan and I and a lot of these counselors, we have experienced firsthand that this just makes the victim feel more alone and feel more hopeless when you say, why don't you just leave? It makes them feel like they're in a rut, like there's nobody there for them, understanding their pain. So basically, Dr. Hamdan goes into saying that we need to have a mental paradigm shift, that leaving is not always the best answer for that specific victim. Sometimes it's as simple as listening to their pain. For many, having the courage to share the abuse is a huge step, and it's her or his way of admitting to themselves that they are in an abusive situation. If they do not want a divorce, do not turn your back on them and blame them. Instead, try to find out how we can make them feel more empowered and safe in an unfortunate situation that they are in. So seeking understanding and having compassion takes effort, right? And that takes a lot of effort. It's much easier to judge and give fast food advice. This is what Dr. Hamdan says. She says giving fast food advice by saying just leave. It's so easy to say that, but it's harder to show compassion and empathy. It takes more effort to understand and listen to someone's pain. And I know as mental health professionals, we do that. We're trained to do that, right? But as community members, we can do this too. And that's why we have these seminars and these education talks to help you understand. If you ask these 3 questions, what can I do to help you? What do you need to feel safer and not worthless? These questions show empathy, show compassion, show love. And that's what these victims of abuse need. And that's what I want all of our community members. When you hear somebody, don't say, oh my God, why isn't she just leaving? Or why isn't he just leaving? Why is he putting up with this? Isn't he a man? Isn't she strong enough? Why is she so weak? Don't say stuff like that. It hurts. It's painful because the mental trauma that these abuse victims are going through, we will never understand. Even if you are an abuse victim and you've survived abuse and you've gone out and you've become successful, you don't know what another abuse victim is going through. Her situation and her or his situation is different from yours. Everybody's situation is different. Yes, but we can learn to empathize because Allah and God has given us that capacity. We have the capacity as human beings to show empathy and to instead of rationalizing in our head, how do we get her out? We need to understand that, yes, we do. That is our goal. We want to build their self-worth and their self-esteem and their self-confidence, that they love themselves so much that they come to the realization themselves that this might be the best time to leave. And that is our goal here at An-Nisa. And I know that's the goal of Multicultural Center and ISGH. And we want to educate our community to love themselves, to reach out to us when you need anyone. We are here. We are here to help you. And thank you so much. And that's about all I wanted to share today.
Jazakallah khair, Sister Amina, for that informative presentation. And now we will begin our question and answer session of our webinar. So if you have any questions you'd like to ask Sister Amina, please text them in the chat box below. I will begin. In the Islamic community, family life is often private, obscure, and hidden from public view. How hard is it for an individual who is experiencing domestic violence to recognize they need help under these conditions?
Okay, what was the last part? Like how hard? Sorry.
How hard is an individual who is experiencing domestic violence under these conditions to recognize that they need help?
So a lot of times, a lot of our victims that call the helpline, that come to us, they don't even realize that what their spouse or what their intimate partner has done to them is abuse. They don't even realize. They usually come. A lot of times we get clients that come here for financial help, and then they'll start talking about their relationships, and they're like, oh, well, I don't have access to money. I don't have access to a car. He stops me from doing things. So this is not really domestic violence. I know y'all only help people with DV situations, but can you help me? But that is abuse. And we have to educate our community on what abuse looks like. And we can probably go into the power and control wheel, but I'm not going to do that today, maybe at another seminar that I do. But it's very hard, especially in the immigrant community. A lot of times they don't even realize that what they're going through is abuse, but they come here because they're reaching out and they want to just talk to someone. And they're like, I'm going through a hard time. I don't know how to deal with this. And they just want advice. They want somebody to listen to them. That's what I was saying. A lot of times they're not ready to leave. A lot of times, most of our clients are not ready to leave. And that is not our job to push them to leave. Our job is to show them that we are here. We are here to support them. And when they are ready, we are here. And, right now we have a full caseload. I mean, as counselors, as a DV counselor, I can't take any more clients right now. And I really feel guilty sometimes. And I know counselors, we're so packed here, and I want to, we've been referring clients out because we have to. And that's why I encourage the community, like MCC, I know y'all have been sending clients over as well. And, we need more organizations that work together, that collaborate together for this.
I agree. You spoke about the importance of having support systems, and again, speaking about the immigrant community, how can immigrant abuse victims start to build that support system when they are in a new country?
Yes, and yes, it's very difficult. They're stuck in situations. A lot of times, immigrant women and men, they're in communities. They're usually staying in apartment complexes and communities that discourage any type of, don't say this, don't tell anyone. But that's why we have, I want everyone to know it's confidential. We are here. We have a hotline, and we also have support groups. So we started an Urdu speaking support group, an Arabic speaking support group, an English support group for DV victims or survivors. And we don't talk about their past. We talk about self-esteem. We talk about self-confidence. It's called the power to change. And that's what we've been focusing on, the power to change your perception of yourself, right? And how you look at yourself. So that's what we have to do. We have to go into these communities. And that's what we do here at UNICEF. We go into these communities and we educate them on loving themselves. And once a woman or man starts to appreciate and love themselves and value their self-worth, that's when they start to understand that maybe this is a time to leave. And that's why they're not going to come to us. It's incumbent upon us as a community to go into these communities. We work with the Burmese community, we work with the Afghani community, and we have volunteers here that are inside those communities. And that's how we get to them. And that's why it's important for organizations, nonprofits. We can't expect everyone to come to us. The way we get people to come to us is by doing seminars like this, but we still have to go into their homes and we have caseworkers that talk to people. We have volunteers from each community that understand, that speak the language. These are things that we have to do as a community, right?
So the onus is always on the people who are victims of domestic violence. But if a perpetrator of domestic violence is not aware of his or her abusive actions within their family, what are the indicators that he or she should look out for?
The abuser should look out for, or the victim?
Yes. Because sometimes people don't know that they are the abuser in a domestic violence, situation.
So, when we talk about domestic violence, people presume that violence, I'm going to use the word domestic abuse, because violence usually means physical violence, right? But domestic abuse means it could be financial, psychological, mental, and spiritual. Oh, that's a huge one in our communities. Spiritual abuse, religious abuse. So the things that you could look out for, if you feel like you're falling into that, it's all about power and control, right? Power and control does not necessarily mean that you got to hit someone. Power and control means that you're controlling their psychological, you're controlling their brain. You're controlling how they move. You're controlling who they meet. You're controlling who they're friends with. You're controlling what they spend their money on, or you give them. A lot of times it's women or men don't have access to money. They don't have access to credit cards to pay for food. That's abuse. This all constant, if you feel like you're being controlled, that is abuse. If you feel like you're going into that, you're controlling someone, whether it be a man or a woman, right? Because a lot of times, like I said, physical violence is usually a man perpetrating on a woman. Women the ones we've seen at Anissa are usually psychological, so where she's demeaning the man. You're not man enough. You're not constant demeaning of someone. You're not good. You don't make enough money. You're not man. You don't have a good job. Constantly putting someone down. It doesn't have to be curse words necessarily. It could be constantly bringing somebody's self-esteem to a point that they stop believing in themselves. That's abuse. When you are and abuse doesn't mean like you've done it once. Like if you've done it once and husband and wives, they fight and they say mean things, I'm not going to say that that's abuse. But if you see yourself doing that even once, stop yourself, because it can lead into an abusive pattern. Domestic abuse has to be a patterned behavior, right? So if you see yourself as a woman or a man that are constantly controlling who she meets or he meets, what they're spending their money on, what they are, you're constantly demeaning them, talking down on the way they look, sexual abuse, all these types of things. If you're like demanding things when she's exhausted and she's tired, and when it's a patterned behavior and you're doing it a lot, that's when it constitutes abuse. If you've done it once or twice, I don't want you to beat yourself up for it, but yeah, maybe kind of beat yourself up for it, but you got to stop. That's where it starts. Once you do it once, it can go into that pattern, and that pattern, once that pattern starts, that's when it becomes domestic abuse, and it becomes it can become violent.
Can an abuser change?
We have batterers prevention programs, and there's so many things that we try to put in place, and we do have, I'm not going to say there's no hope, but most of the cases we have not seen the batterer change. But I feel like when it's come to physical violence, when it's gotten to that point, sometimes it's harder to. But I think that when you catch yourself doing those pattern behaviors and you try to work on yourself, and that you feel guilty and you want to work on yourself, a lot of those men and women that want to work on themselves, they'll seek help. They'll come to counseling. And we do have a few cases where the batterer is coming to us for counseling and they're trying to understand what their behaviors are, and we do help them. We don't want to push away a batterer that is wanting help, right? But in most cases, it's very difficult because they've gone through that power and control that they've had in their life. They feed off of it, right? But I'm not going to say there's no hope. I will never say there's no hope. But in most cases, they do not change. And I want men and women that are being in abusive situations know that it's not your job to change them. They may change 10, 20 years down the road because Allah wanted them to or God wanted them to, but you cannot risk your own mental health for them or for anyone, because your body and your brain are an amana from Allah and from God. It is, you don't want to risk it. Maybe they will change and maybe Allah will give them something. I mean, you can pray for them, but I don't think it should be at the cost of you. It should never be at the cost of yourself.
And finally, are there any local resources available for abuse victims of domestic violence?
Yes, there's lots of them. And, we have shelters and stuff, and a lot of times the shelters are filled, but, there's Daya that works with South Asian women. There's Anissa. We work with all races and ethnicities and religions. So we have been focusing on DV a lot. So we are open to everyone. But right now we do provide case management services. So case management services would be more like helping you find a job, getting you out of the situation, putting you in a shelter, getting you the basic needs and necessities, right? It would be helping you with ESL classes, getting you a good job, or helping you with childcare, figuring those things out, kind of just working your case. And then counseling would come after that. That's when you got your stuff together and you feel like you are grounded, and then you need counseling, right? So we do provide that. And then there's the Fort Bend Women's Shelter. There is a women's shelter in Harris County. There's just so many. And honestly, if you just do a Google search, you'll find, but I'm in the immigrant communities, there's Daya, there's Olive Branch, there's Anissa Hope Center, there's ISGH, there's MCC, reach out to any of us and we will move you, or if we can't do it, we will refer you. Because right now, case management, we have places for case management, and we still do want our clients, we're trying to figure out how we can have more, how we can take on more clients for counseling as well. Because our counseling focuses on self-esteem, self-confidence building, and just building and empowering our clients.
Jazakallah khair. I'd like to sincerely thank Sister Amina for her important and impactful presentation, and thank you all for tuning in to our Family First Center's weekly webinar. Be sure to meet us here each week where we'll be discussing a different topic every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.